There is a moment, and you may have already felt it, where you realize that the world has not changed as much as your relationship to it has. It is not a dramatic shift. It does not announce itself. It arrives the way winter does in some places, quietly, almost apologetically, until one morning you look outside and everything is different. You notice it in the way you respond to noise now. The laughter of a crowd that once pulled you in now feels like interference. The conversation that stretches past midnight, which once felt like intimacy, now feels like an obligation. And somewhere in the space between who you used to be and who you are becoming, you ask yourself a question that is difficult to say out loud. Why am I becoming harder to be around? It is a question that carries shame with it, the way most honest questions do. Because the cultural story we have inherited tells us that warmth should increase with age, that grandparents should be patient, that wisdom should soften a person, that the older you grow, the more gently you should hold the world. And yet, for so many people, the opposite quietly happens. The fuse shortens, the tolerance narrows, the irritability rises, not dramatically, not in moments of obvious crisis, but in the small, ordinary, unseen interactions of everyday life. Someone speaks too slowly, and you feel something tighten inside you. A plan changes at the last minute, and the frustration that moves through you feels disproportionate even to you. You pull back, you go quiet, you choose the room over the party, the window over the door. And what I want to say to you before anything else, before any explanation or framework or psychological language, is this: you are not broken. You are not becoming a bitter person. You are not failing some invisible test of character. What you are experiencing is one of the quietest, least discussed, most profoundly human psychological transformations that exists. And the fact that it frightens you, the fact that you noticed it and came here wondering about it, is itself a form of awareness that most people never develop at all. The psychology of irritability and aging is not a story about anger. It is a story about the mind doing something incredibly sophisticated, reorganizing itself, renegotiating its contracts with the world, and trying to protect what it now understands to be rare and irreplaceable. To understand why this happens, we have to go somewhere deeper than mood. We have to look at how the architecture of emotional life actually shifts across a lifetime, and why that shift, when misunderstood, can look from the outside like bitterness, but from the inside feels more like clarity. When psychologists study how people relate to time as they age, they encounter something that changes almost everything. Young people, broadly speaking, experience time as open. The future is a vast and unwritten space, and because of that, the emotional priorities of youth tend to orient outward, meeting new people, gathering experiences, building networks, acquiring knowledge, expanding the circle. This is not shallow. It is biologically and psychologically sensible. When time feels infinite, breath makes sense. But as people age, and this does not happen at a fixed point, it happens gradually and differently for everyone. The perception of time begins to change. The future, which once felt unlimited, begins to feel more finite, not in a morbid way necessarily, but in a clarifying way. And when that happens, something profound shifts in what the emotional system decides to prioritize. This is the foundation of what the psychologist Laura Carstens spent decades studying and eventually named socio-emotional selectivity theory. The central insight is both simple and staggering. As people become more aware of the limits of time, they naturally, instinctively, and often unconsciously begin to shift their emotional priorities away from breadth and toward depth. They stop caring as much about meeting new people and start caring far more about the quality of the connections they already have. They stop seeking novel experiences for their own sake and begin to invest more deeply in the experiences that feel genuinely meaningful. The emotional goal in youth is largely about information and expansion. The emotional goal in later life becomes much more about meaning and emotional resonance. Now here is where irritability enters the picture, and why it makes complete psychological sense once you understand the framework. When your emotional system has made this shift, when it has on some level recalibrated around meaning and depth and the quiet urgency of finite time, then interactions that feel empty begin to cost something that they simply did not cost before. Small talk that once passed pleasantly now drains you. Social obligations that once seemed harmless now feel like they are eating time you can feel you do not have in the same way. Noise, chaos, meaningless conflict, the low-grade friction of daily life, all of it registers differently when the emotional system is no longer optimized for expansion. It is optimized for preservation. And when something threatens what feels preserved and meaningful, the response is not sadness, it is irritability. It is the emotional equivalent of a boundary being enforced. What is often misread as a person becoming difficult with age is, at its core, the emotional immune system becoming more specific. It is not that older people feel more. Studies consistently show that older adults actually report greater emotional stability and a greater ability to regulate their emotional responses than younger adults do. What changes is not the volume of the emotion, but the threshold. The system has learned what matters, and it responds accordingly when something does not meet that threshold, or when something intrudes upon what does. There is another layer to this that rarely gets discussed, and it lives in the relationship between aging and identity. For most of adulthood, identity is constructed largely through roles. You are a professional, a parent, a spouse, a provider, a creator, a member of a community or institution. These roles do not just tell the world who you are, they tell you who you are. They organize your days, your decisions, your sense of purpose, your social position, and for decades, the maintenance of those roles is so constant that the deeper question of who you are beneath them rarely has to be asked. But aging, and particularly the transitions that accompany it, retirement, children leaving, the death of peers, the gradual withdrawal from public life, removes those roles one by one. And when the roles begin to go, what remains is something far less structured and far more confronting. The question of identity becomes not what do I do, but who am I when I am not doing anything at all. This is not a crisis for everyone, but for many people, it produces a kind of low-grade existential disorientation that has no clean name. And that disorientation, when it goes unacknowledged, when there is no language for it and no space to process it, tends to express itself in the emotional body as irritability, rigidity, or withdrawal. The rigidity deserves particular attention because it is one of the most commonly noticed and least compassionately understood aspects of aging psychology. When a person becomes increasingly resistant to change, when they prefer the familiar, when they push back against new ideas or new arrangements, the cultural instinct is to call it stubbornness, to roll your eyes, to say quietly that they are set in their ways. But consider for a moment what familiarity actually represents to a mind that has spent decades building a coherent world. Routine is not laziness. For the aging mind, familiar patterns are a form of emotional regulation. They reduce cognitive load. They provide predictability. They create a sense of continuity between who you were and who you are. When that continuity is disrupted, even by something small, a changed dinner plan, a rearranged room, an unexpected visit, the disruption is not just inconvenient. It is, on some level, a small challenge to the coherence of self. And the self, when it is already navigating the larger disruptions of aging, does not have surplus resources for the small ones. What the mind is trying to adapt to, then, is not simply getting older. It is the ongoing task of holding a coherent identity together under conditions of continuous loss and transition. The loss of people, the loss of roles, the loss of physical capacity, the loss of the future tense as an unlimited resource. And none of these losses are announced. None of them come with a ceremony or a pause or a moment where the world stops to acknowledge what is happening. They accumulate quietly, and the emotional responses they produce, the irritability, the withdrawal, the nostalgia, the heightened sensitivity, are not character flaws. They are the mind's honest responses to a profoundly demanding set of circumstances. Nostalgia, in particular, is worth pausing on because it is so often dismissed as a kind of sentimentality, a refusal to live in the present. But psychologically, nostalgia serves a deeply important function. When the present feels uncertain or diminished, and when the future feels less available as a source of hope, memory becomes something different than it was before. It becomes not just a record of the past, but a resource for the present. The act of remembering a time when you felt strong, or loved, or purposeful is not escapism. It is the mind reaching back to evidence of your own worth when the present does not easily provide it. The problem is that this reaching back, when it becomes the dominant orientation, can create a subtle but persistent dissatisfaction with the now. Everything new is measured against what was. Every person is compared to someone who has been lost. Every experience is weighed against a memory that time has smoothed into something more beautiful than it ever actually was. And that comparative lens, without intending to, can make the present feel like a disappointment. And disappointment, when it is chronic and unnamed, has a particular tendency to express itself as irritability. There is something else here that lives beneath all of this. Something quieter and perhaps more important. It is the gradual movement in aging toward what psychologists sometimes call an internal locus of evaluation. In earlier life, much of how we measure our worth comes from the outside. The promotion, the approval, the recognition, the sense that we are seen and valued by the people and institutions around us. This is not vanity. It is how social animals calibrate their place in the world. But as those external structures shift, as the career ends and the children leave and the social circle narrows, many people find that the old external measures no longer hold their meaning, and something begins to turn inward. The judgment of a life moves, slowly and sometimes painfully, from the question of what others have thought of me to the question of what I have actually meant and done and felt and loved. This is one of the great psychological tasks of later life, and it is not easy, because an honest internal audit is far more demanding than an external one. External validation can be accumulated and displayed. Internal meaning has to be felt, and for people who have spent decades building their sense of self largely around what they produced or provided or performed, the transition to an internal measure can feel deeply disorienting. The irritability that sometimes accompanies this transition is, in part, the sound of that disorientation. It is the friction between the self that was oriented outward and the self that is slowly learning to turn in.
What distinguishes the people who navigate this transition with something resembling grace from those who do not is not personality, and it is not even circumstance. It is, more than anything, the presence of what might be called conscious solitude. Not loneliness, which is the painful awareness of unwanted aloneness, but solitude, which is the deliberate and nourishing retreat into one's own inner life. There is a quality to the way certain people age that is unmistakably different. There is a stillness to them, not emptiness, but settled presence. A sense that they have found something inward that does not require external noise to sustain itself. And that quality does not come from avoiding the discomforts of aging. It comes from sitting with them long enough to understand what they are trying to communicate. Because irritability, withdrawal, nostalgia, rigidity, all of these are the mind trying to communicate something. They are not failures of character. They are signals. They are the emotional vocabulary of a person whose inner life is in genuine transition, who is being asked, by time itself, to renegotiate the terms of their relationship with the world. The person who becomes short-tempered when plans change is often a person who is, on some deeper level, protecting a sense of order they can no longer take for granted. The person who withdraws from social gatherings is often a person whose emotional system has become more honest than polite, more protective of what is real than invested in what is merely comfortable. The person who speaks less and listens differently and seems to look at the world through a slightly different lens is often a person who has begun to see, with the clarity that only time can produce, what matters and what does not. And so I want to offer you something before we close. Not advice exactly, something more like a permission slip. You are allowed to have changed. You are allowed to find that what once brought you energy now quietly drains it, that what once seemed important has been rearranged in your private hierarchy of meaning, that the version of yourself that was relentlessly social, effortlessly patient, endlessly available, was never entirely you,
but was in part a performance shaped by roles and expectations and the urgency of becoming. You are allowed to be less interested in performing and more interested in living. You are allowed to be quieter. You are allowed to protect your peace with a seriousness that younger people may not yet understand. Your worth is not measured by your output, your energy, your social radius, or your tolerance for things that have begun to feel genuinely meaningless to you. It is measured, if it must be measured at all, by the depth of the life you have actually lived, the quality of the love you have actually felt, the honesty with which you have actually met yourself in the quieter moments when no one was watching. Aging is not the mind declining. Sometimes, and far more often than we allow ourselves to believe, it is the mind finally arriving, rearranging its priorities, letting go of the unnecessary weight, and learning, slowly and imperfectly and beautifully, to live from the inside out. You are not becoming difficult. You are becoming more yourself. And that, quiet as it may be, is not something to be afraid of. It is something to be known.